With this presentation, I'll talk about the European apparel industry. There have been quite a few developments, particularly since the quota arrangement finished in 2005 when the world market was liberalized. And I'm trying to look at both different quantitative data, the trends over time, as well as some case studies that I've been involved in. And then look at some institutional solutions at the European level and try to assess to what extent they are appropriate. The debate on economic and social upgrading comes out of global value chain debates. Economic upgrading has different facets, from product process upgrading to value chain upgrading. It was seen as fairly limiting. So to add in a specific focus on social upgrading that focuses on improvements in employment standards, rights at work, social protection, social dialogue, was something that made sense and I think is a step forward. At an empirical level, there are, as you'd expect, economic studies that argue that GVC participation supports industrialization and productivity growth. Interestingly, even at that level, people talk about a mixed blessings hypothesis, which essentially is that growth in industrialization and productivity cannot be seen at the level of employment. So there's no corresponding employment growth. There are particularly negative consequences for unskilled labor, because as global value chains evolve, they require higher technology inputs, which obviously disadvantages unskilled workers. The more technology is required, the more difficult that can become and can actually lead to reshoring of functions that have initially been offshored. So that's, in a sense, the economist's perspective, working with large data sets. There's a lot of case study and qualitative evidence that obviously develops a much more complex account of the development of firm strategies as well as developments within GVCs as a whole. So they're not unilinear. GVC integration, for example, can happen through downgrading. Firms can decide to downgrade at the same time as they increase their market share. So it's a deliberate strategy that actually leads to growth. At the same time, as I'll be talking about in more detail later on, reshoring can also be supported by permissive regulatory and enforcement environment. So essentially, it's the social downgrading that attracts reshoring and an increase in participation in global value chains. Why is this important? These discussions, I think it's very interesting that the World Bank in its 2020 development report has really bought into this, not only bought into this framework, but also kind of revived a very linear growth stage theory that we used to look at in probably the 1960s. There's a very interesting critique by Jennifer Baer on that. So it really implies causalities and unilinearity in development that is at odds with a lot of studies that we see within the GVC paradigm. So what I want to look at basic evidence within the European apparel industry and see to what extent macro and case study data, what they can tell us. So to start with, we have an interesting development within the core European countries, where obviously a lot of the industry has been offshored. At the same time, we have regional clusters, very intense regional clusters, where there's a lot of production going on. Counterintuitively, production has grown in places like Leicester in the UK, as well as Prato in Italy. They take advantage of historical clusters of garment and textile production. At the same time, we have a similar kind of setting, a very vulnerable migrant workforce. The growth of the industry is based on systematic wage theft, a lot of flexibility within the labor process, whereby basically workers are on tap. So in Leicester, workers live around the corner of the factories. In Prato, there's lots of cases where they actually sleep in the factory. So it's an ultimate flexibility to satisfy the demands of orders of intense production and quick turnaround. Essentially, it's an informal zero-hour factory regime, and it's also supported by lack of enforcement in terms of the institutional environment. So in that sense, what we see there is there's neither economic upgrading nor social upgrading associated with that, but there's an environment created that encourages nearshoring. So fast fashion industry requires production to be very close to consumer markets. The case of Leicester, there was an expose, a very public scandal where the main brand Boohoo was caught up in violations of COVID restrictions on top of the mainstream exploitative regime. As a consequence, the brand has left to a large extent, and production has been shifted to Morocco. I'll say something a bit later about the due diligence. I was involved in another piece with colleagues from Greenwich and Cardiff that looked at a Turkish supplier, and interestingly, that supplier was subject to an international framework agreement. So on paper complied with the ILO labor provisions, but there was a similar situation whereby workers couldn't get any remedy. The supplier absconded, workers couldn't claim their wages. So even though there was supply chain institutions that should have provided for remediation, workers could not get anywhere in that regard. If we look at the way the European market has shifted, we see a huge shift in the way China has really increased its share of EU15 imports. Same with Bangladesh. We then have a different layer whereby, for example, Turkey is still a very important importer. But you also see differences, for example, with Morocco and Tunisia, I believe, whereby their share of EU imports has declined, whereas their absolute value production has increased. The value of their imports have increased. These are export values. What's more interesting, really, is if we look at the entire value chain. So there are databases that essentially that rely on input-output data and can track not just the value of exports, but the value added that's embedded in a product. So not so that the value added doesn't just come from the factory that produces the final good, but all the other stages of production really that have been involved in that whatever it is, a jumper, a shirt, etc. Again, we see that China has increased its value added. A couple of other countries that have done well, such as Cambodia and Vietnam. Everyone else has essentially lost, and which would point to economic downgrading. So this is a logarithmic scale, which is much more compressed. Otherwise, China would be somewhere on the ceiling with this. But essentially, the point is that we see, except for very few exceptions, general trends of economic downgrading. If we look at the sort of broad European space, major producers in the European and neighboring countries, there's an interesting development as well in that the value added in final product exports generally has decreased, even though we see differences in the level. So Turkey still produces, still has a value added of 57% as share of its gross exports, whereas Morocco, for example, only has 39. At the same time, Turkey has a much higher level in terms of intermediate product exports, the value added there. Generally, that points to a much more integrated industry in Turkey, whereas Morocco is really a newcomer, depends very much on exports to the European Union as opposed to anywhere else, and has an industry which isn't very integrated. Essentially, it's an extended factory for the European market. What we see in the intermediate product exports is that there are some differences. So some countries could increase their value added here. And in a sense, it's important because it points to very different structures of the industries, which give different options, strategic options, I would say, both to companies as well as to labor in the way they can essentially build leverage within value chains. What's interesting is to look at labor income shares. There is a BIP that we can see when we look at the trend for Romania and Slovakia. These are to do with labor shortages. So there were periods when there was a lot of immigration of workers from those countries to the European Union, which led to shortages in the textile industry, in the garment industry, and as a consequence, then labor temporarily was able to exercise a slightly exercise its power and get a higher level of income share, but this was very temporary. Broadly, again, if we look at the way hourly output and hourly compensation has developed between 2000 2014, I mean, some of these data ranges are different because the data, as you can imagine, are not very comprehensive at some level. Again, the industry bracket textiles, wearing apparel, and leather products is very broad, obviously. So we have to take all these things with a pinch of salt. But generally, again, what we can see is that Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Turkey, output increased much faster than hourly compensation. So again, we do have, well, we don't really have an argument at that level that there has been any kind of social upgrading. The industries have been integrated into the European apparel space, have not really been able to upgrade economically. At the same time, the outcomes for workers weren't really such that they benefited from that higher integration into the European market. Now, if we go back briefly to the case studies I mentioned before, in Leicester, Boohoo, that large brand, has left, essentially, has shifted the bulk of its production to Morocco. On paper, become a beacon of corporate and ESG standards. In Turkey, workers pursued claims in court and won that battle, but lost in the sense that the supplier, the employer, couldn't be found anymore, and in the end got a hardship payment. So that's not remediation for lost wages. It's kind of a well, it's a hardship favor, essentially, that Inditex paid in order to avoid reputational damage. Obviously, there are multiple interests in creating that economic space the European Union has developed with neighboring countries beyond European Union borders. So that goes from the east, from Moldova, to countries such as Morocco, Egypt, etc. There are transnational standards in a number of different instruments. So the European Union has concluded trade agreements with those countries that include labor provisions, essentially referencing ILO standards. There are also debates of creating a mandatory human rights due diligence instruments. The problem with that is that is focused on the firm level, that it emphasizes procedure as opposed to consequences for non-compliance, and there are not really any functioning monitoring and enforcement schemes. Also, mandatory human rights due diligence can actually serve as a incentive, really, for companies. It can insulate companies against civil liability and doesn't necessarily help, let's say, social dialogue or labor rights on the ground. In many ways, that's been confirmed through case studies. So, for example, Adrian Smith from Queen Mary has looked at the impact labor provisions in trade agreements have, and essentially concluded that when those transnational instruments reach national frameworks and local labor regime, that's essentially the end of it. And the local labor regime, the power balances within that between capital and labor really trump anything that any of these instruments that can be mobilized from outside. Similar case, we would argue, would be with regard to human rights due diligence. It's a liberal rights framework and neglects the interests, power, and capacity that undermine the implementation and the pursuit of remediation, and doesn't really look at building collective institutions in that. So at the moment, what we really see in the garment industry, that there are shifts, geographical shifts, that exist, but the power balance really is on the market side. Capital mobility really trumps any effectiveness of labor trying to build collective institutions. So I'll leave it for here.